Hey, welcome to part 4 of Deploy a Python web application on Linode from scratch. This one is all about actually building our web application using FastAPI. Now, if you've never built a web application before, this is going to be a lot of new things for you, and I'm really excited to show you. But if you have, just realize that we're only scratching the surface of what you can do with a Python web application, and this is much more about getting it into production onto an actual host than anything else. Now, this is part 4 of the series, so be sure that you check the description for links for all of the other parts in this series, and there's also time codes down there as well, so you can jump around as you need. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so what I'm going to be doing in this one is downloading Python 3 and creating a virtual environment. So that's going to be Python 3-m venv period. Now, of course, if you don't have Python installed or you don't know what a virtual environment manager is, we're going to discuss that in a moment. But if you do have Python installed, do something along these lines. And to be very specific to what I'm doing, I'm actually going to be using Python 3.7. So before I actually execute that, let's go ahead and talk about why it is that there's different versions of Python and why we use a virtual environment in the first place. So if we actually go to python.org, what we'll see here is a download tab, and you can click on one of your systems, like whatever system you're currently working on. This is not for the Linode. This is just for our local development environment. I'm on a Mac, but the same thing works for Windows. And if we scroll all the way down, we're going to see a bunch of different versions. Look at that, Python 2.0.1. It came out in June 22nd, 2001. So that is 20 years old, and we can still download and use it. I do not recommend that you do that, especially as a beginner. There might be cases that even as a beginner, you would want to use that. But the general idea is over time, new versions come out. And look at this, even Python 2.4 has a macOS installer. I would imagine Windows does as well. So I'm actually not going to be using Python 2. Instead, I'm going to be using Python 3. That's the most modern version of Python. And if you're a beginner, the differences between the two are mostly minor, but we do want to use Python 3 because that is what we'll be using on our FastAPI application that requires Python 3.6 and above. And there's another reason which we'll get into in a moment. So what we're going to do here is actually download the version of Python that we need that will match our production environment. That is our Linode's Python version. So that will mean that we do a couple things. If we jump back into our SSH session into our Linode and I say, who am I should see that it is that CFE user or whatever username you decided. And if I list things out, right now I'm currently in var.ww, right? And also I can tell that I'm in an SSH session because of this. So what I want to do here is I want to check what version of Python I have. So if I just type out Python-V, I see that it says 2.7.16. And right off the bat, you might be like, well, wait a minute, I don't want to use Python 2. We just went over that. So oftentimes what you'll see on these systems is Python 3-V. So actually writing out Python 3, you will see a different version of Python. And so this is what we'll end up using in production on the remote host on the Linode server. We'll be using that Python 3 and whatever that version is. And in this case, it's 3.7. So the first two numbers are what's important here, not so much the last number. Certainly the last number can be important, but in this case, we're just going to go off of the first two numbers, so Python 3.7. And so if I actually jump back into the downloads on python.org for my system, I can actually scroll through here looking for the latest version of Python 3.7. So it looks like Python 3.7.10 is the latest version, but notice there's nothing in here that says a installer, right? So ignoring the first part of this, depending on your system, but we want to find something that says installer. The installer significantly decreases the barriers to actually get Python installed, especially if you're a beginner, but even if you're more advanced, you don't necessarily have to compile the correct version. It just takes a long time. So what I want to do is actually look for an installer. So 3.7.9, I can definitely download this installer right here, and I'm going to let it do that. Notice that it's only like 30 megabytes. It's not really that big. I think the Windows one might be a little bit bigger, but overall, it's not really that big of a program. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up. And of course, if you're on Windows, you're going to want to do the same. And we just want to accept a lot of the defaults here, right? And so once I install it, I have to put in my password. I got to do all of those sort of standard installation processes to get Python up and running. And so I actually have a different version of Python 3 on my machine already. So we'll see if it actually creates conflicts. It certainly can. Because you use different versions of Python, you might actually run into conflicts that happen. But I'm going to actually let this finish building, and then we'll come back. So it's not quite done yet, but something I wanted to mention for you Windows users, it's going to ask you to put it to the path. And the answer is yes, you absolutely want to put it in the path. And you probably notice that ding that it actually finished. But the idea is path. Do you want to add it as a path variable? The answer to that is yes. I do have installation videos for Python on Windows, so let me know in the comments if you need that, because it can get a little tricky sometimes on Windows. But now that I have Python 3.7 installed, I'm going to go back into my local terminal window, and I'm going to type out Python 3.7 -V and see that it's Python 3.7.9. Now, this is true for me on a Mac, right? Because I also have a different version of Python 3 installed, right? So I have a bunch of different versions of Python on my local system, and I believe the installers are intelligent enough that Python 3 will also be the newest version of Python, where if you are a little bit more specific to the version, it's going to show that one. But anyway, so that actually gives us Python, which is great. Now we just need to use that built-in module to create a virtual environment. But before I do, this is what I want to test out with you. And I want to make sure that pip is installed. Now that I have Python, we have something called the Python package installer. That's what pip is. If for some reason that's not working, you can do something like that. Python 3, let me just bring that back up. You can do Python 3-pip, and that's the same thing, right? So, and if you're on Windows, you're probably going to end up using just Python-pip. So making sure that you have Python-v, whatever that number is, hopefully it's 3.7, and just remembering that if you are on a Mac, actually typing out 3.7 is going to be your best bet. Okay, cool. So pip, the package installer, comes in two flavors as well, pip 3 as well as pip. So definitely gets a little confusing, and this is where the version things come in, and this is why we use virtual environments, because it helps remove some of that confusion. But the idea here is if I do pip freeze on my system, it has a few things already installed. And these things might be in conflict with my packages. And if I do pip 3 freeze, I'll probably see, well, in this case, it's the exact same things that are installed. But what if I did Python 3.7-m pip freeze, and I took a look here? There are different things that are installed with different versions, right? So this is the key thing here, is we want to isolate our code and isolate the versions to our particular project. And now these versions, I didn't personally install them. I don't remember installing these things, so I don't actually know what's going on here. I could probably make a guess, and I could probably look into it, but we don't need to worry about that right now. Instead, what we want to do is we want to be in the root of our project, which was the folder here, that dev folder that we created. Of course, the same place as our VS Code here. And then I'm going to go ahead and use Python 3.7-m as in module. This is a built-in module, much like we saw with pip. This one is VE&V, and that stands for virtual environment. It's just a shortened way to write virtual environment. And we're going to put period here, and then I'm going to hit enter. And so this actually creates my first virtual environment. But realistically, this is actually not where I want it. I will change it, but I just want to show you how easy it is to create a virtual environment. Now what I'm going to do is actually hit make directory of app, and then I'm going to cd into app, and I'm going to do that all over again, the exact same thing. And it's going to create it. It takes a moment, and there it is. Okay, so I now have two places for my virtual environment. And what we notice here is inside of my app, these pieces are grayed out, but inside of the root of the project, they are not. So what I want to do is actually delete the other virtual environment, and that's really simple. I can delete either one of them the same way. First, we remove bin, then we remove include, and then we remove lib. I'll explain these things in a moment again. remove all of lib, the entire folder, and pi virtual environment configuration. We delete that. And what we see here is still 946 items being tracked. And that's actually because, in my case, it's grayed out. Yours might be green. It probably will be. That's because of our git ignore, right? So with our git ignore, we don't want our virtual environment stuff coming in here. So if I actually do git status, what I should see is, let's see where I'm at, is inside of the app, it's actually going to try and track everything in that app. So yet again, I'm going to go ahead and delete this folder. We want to get really comfortable with doing this process of just deleting things. And just to make sure that my git status, oops, I should have moved back. Let me just go ahead and create a new terminal window here and just be inside of my project here. Now if I do git status, we have nothing untracked, right? So I'm going to go ahead and make a directory again, and this time it's called app. And again, I could have done it up here as well. And I'm going to cd into app, and I'm just going to go ahead and touch main.py, which creates it. If you're on Windows, touch I don't believe works, but you could just go ahead and create that file up here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and say hashtag hello world. That's it, right? So I just added a little thing into this Python file. We'll address that later. But now if I do git status, I see that again it's trying to create that folder, or that folder was created. So I'm going to go ahead and do git add -- all, git commit, and initial app, something like that, right? Again, we don't have that virtual environment because I completely deleted it. So let's go ahead and create that virtual environment again. So Python 3.7, or if you're on Windows, it's probably just going to be Python 3.7-m v period. Hit enter. And again, here are all of those virtual environment folders. And if I do git status, I see that those are in there. So now I can actually add these into my git ignore file here, right? Because I don't want the virtual environment to track these things. So if I save that git ignore and do git status, I shouldn't actually have those files coming in any longer, right? And the reason that it's not in the root here is because of the fact that I'm inside of the app. That's why it says .. /git ignore, right? So if I go back into the root of it where the Git repository is, remember, it's right here. And now if I do git status, it shows me the correct git ignore. So this will not track any folder named bin, lib, or any file name pi venv cfg, which is config. Another thing I want to actually add in here is the include folder. It doesn't have anything currently, but I do want to get rid of it. Okay, so now let's go ahead and actually use our virtual environment and see why I actually have this ability, or why I'm actually using this. So if I go into the app itself and then do source bin/activate, now that's true for us Mac and Linux users. If you're on Windows, it's going to be /scripts/activate to activate your virtual environment. And what we do in here is now if I type out simply Python -V, I actually see Python 3.7.9. And if I do which Python, this should also show me that it's giving me the version of Python in this virtual environment. It is based off of the one inside of this bin folder and in here. Now these are probably shortcutted to other places, but what isn't necessarily shortcutted is going to be the actual packages that we install. So if I do pip install FastAPI, this is actually how I get that package inside of my virtual environment, and that will go inside a lib here, and there it is right there. So as you notice, this is all of the code that's coming from this particular package. There's all kinds of packages. So we can actually look at these, the pieces of code that's in here, and yeah, I could totally make changes to it, and it actually would work differently. It's probably a good idea to not do that inside of these site packages, but it is nice to know that it exists there. Now, these packages that are being installed on my Mac are going to be slightly different, or they can be slightly different on a Windows. They can be slightly different on a Linux. So the idea here is we want to have a virtual environment locally that we're working on with hopefully all of this same package information. But then we also want to have a virtual environment in our production environment doing the same thing, sort of isolating the code as much as we possibly can. So that's it locally, right? So what we now need to do is actually bring this into production and have something for our actual virtual environment in production. And just to recap, we can deactivate our virtual environment like that. And whenever you see bin include lib, and I think there's another one for Windows, I think it's scripts, but we can also do source bin / activate. That's how you activate your virtual environment, and we can do pip freeze. It's incredibly common to forget to activate your virtual environment. And then you're going to run your application and be like, hey, it says it doesn't know about this, right? It's going to be like, I don't know what FastAPI is. So let's actually take a look at that for just a moment. All I'm going to do is a very simple import on main.py. I will certainly come back to this, but I wanted to show you the challenges of not activating your virtual environment. So here I am inside of the project with main.py with an import here. And if I write out Python 3 main.py, it's going to give me this error. No module named FastAPI. Now, this is a simple fix, something that over time you'll definitely recognize. And that is there is no virtual environment activated, which is denoted by this right here. And it basically takes the name of the folder that it's in, and then that is the virtual environment. So if I activate this source bin / activate, or again, if you're on Windows, it's script / activate, then we run Python main.py or Python 3 main.py. This time, we don't necessarily get an error. It doesn't really do anything, but we don't have an import error of any kind. And that's just a really simple way to test that. So yeah, there's a lot of things that could potentially go wrong with Python and virtual environments and all these different versions. Now, this is true for other programming languages as well. They all handle versions a little bit differently. And if you're coming from like Node or Node.js and how package.json works, pip kind of works that way in a sense, but it's not exactly the same. So the general idea is to use a virtual environment to isolate our code and to make sure that we activate it when we are working in that code. I'll definitely remind you to activate it in the future, and I just removed the activated version anyway. So when in doubt, activate your virtual environment, because you can't activate it too many times. Like, that's just not possible. It will tell you that it's already activated, but you won't do it too many times. All right, so that's just a little bit of a review of installing Python and using a virtual environment. Now let's actually do the same thing in production, because it's a little bit more tricky. All right, so what we need to do now is enable virtual environments on our Linode. And to do this, that means that we have to log in to root to allow for a few packages to be installed. And so let's go ahead and SSH into our root. So again, if you're back into the Linode console, into your Linode, let's go ahead and copy the SSH command. And in my case, that password, I still have it referenced right here. I'm going to go ahead and log in. And there we go. Okay, cool. So now that I'm logged in, I want to do sudo apt update, right? I just want to make sure that it will find the packages that I need. And it's just a few of them. So in the last one, we talked a little bit about pip, that's the Python package installer. And we also talked about venv. These things don't ship by default in the Linux version of Python 3.7. They certainly can, in some cases they do, but in this case they do not. So what we need to do here is sudo apt get install, and it's going to be python 3-pip, and then python 3-venv, and then python 3-dev. Now, there is certainly other packages that we might add into this, right? So if you see other packages that you had to install, let us know in the comments so that everyone knows what these packages are, especially if you are using a different version of Python 3. And I'm going to go ahead and say yes. So -y, yes, and let that install. There we go. Great. And now what I'll do is go back into my other user, which is CFE. And so now what I want to check is the fact that I can actually create a virtual environment here. But of course, before I do that, let's just ship the basic things that app has, the actual folder for app. I don't need to necessarily recreate it. So I'll go ahead and do git status here. And I did make some changes in that last one. Really simple changes. First off, the git ignore was adding just virtual environment things that we want to ignore. And then main.py only had this simple import. I didn't actually really do a whole lot there. So let's go ahead and add these though. And I'll do git add -- all git commit, and we'll just say our initial project. And then we'll do git push linode main. There we go. So going back into that SSH session, we can list things out, and sure enough, app is in there. And this is actually where I'll put my virtual environment here as well. So what we want to do here is Python 3, and again, we can check the version. It's 3.7.3. Of course, if you have 3.8 or 3.9 or potentially even 4, which Python 3 won't show 4 most likely, but if you did have 4, it probably will work as well. So anyways, let's go ahead and do this. Python 3-m venv period, hit enter. So this hopefully will create our virtual environment for us, and in this case it did not. Now, if what we did in the root environment was successful, that would be great. It's certainly possible that after you run this install, you might need to just reboot your Linode and make sure it's going there. So that simple command is sudo reboot, or you can reboot it in the console as well. Every once in a while, that is something you might need to do when you install major packages. And so I'm just going to assume that yours worked just like mine did, as it should, but there's certainly a possibility that it did not. So if I do source bin/activate in here, it's giving me this error, source not found. So I actually can't activate it like this. So that's a little bit of a problem that we want to address. So let's go ahead and clear that out. And so this is just another case of where sometimes Linux distributions don't work like other Linux distributions. So it's actually good to know that, hey, if source is not working, what we can try is period, which is an executable. So we would execute bin/activate. Now, if you're from Windows, you're like, hey, this looks very familiar because you Windows users have been using script/activate. So it's almost the exact same thing. And, it's maybe a little frustrating to be like, oh, I have another command I need to remember. In the long run, the answer is no. We won't actually need another command to remember because this is not what we're going to do. We're not actually going to activate our virtual environment going forward. We just need to do it right now just to make sure that, well, it works. So let's go ahead and do pip install and FastAPI here. Now, before I actually do that, if I hit Control-C, I can actually see the version of Python is Python 3.7. And again, if I deactivated this and then Python-V, it's Python 2.7. So that is just the simplest way to see that our virtual environment is activated and it is working ideally correctly. So again, let's go ahead and activate this one with .bin/activate, and then we'll go ahead and do Python-V again, and we can also do pip freeze. Now, in some cases, this actual command of pip might not end up working, and if that's the case, we just use Python-m pip freeze, and then we can see that working there. Okay, so using pip, either version of using pip, we can install FastAPI. So pip install and FastAPI. Of course, this is going to install it inside of that virtual environment, which we'll address again once we actually start deploying a proper app. And so what we should see now is if we do pip freeze, I should see FastAPI in there, and sure enough it is. And then if I list things out again, I should see main.py in here. Again, that's our app, but I now have all of these other files in here that I didn't have before, which is fine. That's not a big deal. Now I'm going to go ahead and run python main.py, and I actually shouldn't get an error. Now, if I did pip uninstall FastAPI, that will remove FastAPI from here. We say yes to agree, and then I try to run it again. This time it's just python main.py. Now I should get that module not found error. This same error should happen if we are not activated. So if I deactivate this and then do python main.py, the same error should happen. Okay, so let's go ahead and activate it again and actually install it. Actually, instead of activating it, let's try one more thing. And what we're going to do here is do bin/python and capital V. Notice that it has a different version of Python than the system. So this is the actual local one that I have right here, which is going to match the production one to some degree. We do have a version of Python in there as well as in the production one. So if I list out the production one, I do have all of these scripts that I can actually run. So Python is available by just writing bin/Python. That gives me that virtual environment Python. So what I can actually do is bin/pip3 or pip install FastAPI just like that, right? So in theory, that would actually run that for me, right? And in some cases, it's not necessarily going to execute that cleanly in this case, right? So we can try that same thing with bin/Python and then do module pip install FastAPI, and we hit enter. Oh yeah, because I'm in the bin. That's why it's not working. So let's cd back, and now again bin/pip install FastAPI. This should actually install FastAPI into that virtual environment too. So it's actually not activated right now. So let's go ahead and activate it. So bin/activate and pip freeze, and we should see FastAPI in there. And sure enough, we do. Now, what this is sort of doing for us is moving all of this code into a different location than the global version of Python. Now, with one single project on this Linode, this might be maybe overkill. Maybe you don't actually have to do this, but we always want to get into really good habits, and using virtual environments are those really good habits. So, of course, now that we actually have this virtual environment, and hopefully you understand that the fact that I can run bin/Python main.py, this will actually give me roughly the same thing as if I had the virtual environment activated. And the other part of this that's really cool is if I use the exact path to that version of Python, as in bin/Python main.py, or more specifically, if I used also that path to main.py, this is the absolute path to that version of Python, and then the absolute path to that version of main.py. This will come into play later, but it's giving me an exact place as to where those things are, which I think is going to be really nice to use later. But when I was learning this stuff, it was really confusing as to like how all of this kind of sort of fit together and why we even use virtual environments. It's really about those versions. That's it. And this might feel like it's complicated, but once you do it a few times, it's really not that complicated. It's just different locations for where we need to run things. It's just, you might have to remember, just generally speaking, where is that Python? How do I find that Python version? We will definitely look at it again just to make things easier for us in the future, but we now have a production level virtual environment, which is great. So we're really kind of ready for the next step, which is actually building our actual web application itself. And locally, those same commands work as well. So it works very similar to this. Locally, it's just the paths, as in where that Python is located and where main.py is located, are going to be slightly different, right? So if I go into my local project, this is the path to main.py, right? That's it. If I hit enter, it's not necessarily going to run it, but it is the path to where that file actually exists on my local machine. But on all of our production machines, hopefully, if you did exactly like me, these will be the exact same paths, which I think hopefully help us keep us all on the same exact page. So now let's go ahead and create that application. All right, so the moment you've all been waiting for, and that's actually building our web application, at least our fundamental one inside of FastAPI, or using FastAPI. So in order for us to do this, we want to be working locally. Now, for me, it's pretty easy to know when I'm working locally because I have this little icon here denoting my local terminal. And then, of course, if I'm in production, the root user is going to say root at localhost. And then my other user is just going to have a $sign there. And if I say, who am I should actually be able to see what that username is. And of course, this is SSH. So make sure that you're working locally. In my case, on a Mac OS, it's a Z shell. If you're on Windows, it's probably going to say PowerShell there. But anyway, so now that I'm in here, I'm going to go ahead and do source bin/activate. And of course, if you're on Windows, it's script/activate, and some Linux versions, you're going to do .bin/activate like that. And now we've got our virtual environment activated. And if we do pip freeze in here, we should see the things that I currently have installed, right? So I actually installed FastAPI already. And if you didn't have it installed already, you would just do pip install FastAPI, and that will install that package. Now, in our case, this is a package we need to use for this project. Now, not all projects need this particular package, obviously, but the idea is we still need to know about this package or other packages for that matter. So the question might be is, where do I find these other packages? And that's pypi.org. That's pypi.org. And this is how you can find those pip packages or these published Python packages. And you can publish them here as well. So anybody can do this, which is really, really nice. And you see there's a lot of projects, a lot of releases, a lot of files, a lot of stuff going on here. And if you're familiar with Node.js, this is very similar to NPM. They work a little bit differently on how they are configured and all that, but the general idea is roughly the same. People can make third-party packages and publish them so anyone else can use them. And that's what we're doing. We're using somebody else's code called FastAPI, and that's all hosted on PyPI. So if we search in here and type out FastAPI, I can find the version that I need. So in this case, 0.65.1 is what's out. So I can absolutely install that particular version. I can do pip install and FastAPI equals to 0.65.1 and hit enter. Now, that actually is one of those things that's really, really critical for our virtual environments. But the question is, how do I keep track of this? How do I make sure that my production environment and my local environment are using the same package versions as well as the same Python versions? We already went over the Python versions part with the virtual environments, but even more so, we need to make sure that we're using the same packages. And to do this, we create a file called requirements.txt. Now, requirements.txt is a simple and easy way to remember how to install things much like this. So if I actually went into requirements.txt and added this, saved it, of course, and ran pip install -r as in requirements file, and I go to requirements.txt, hit enter, it's going to install that exact same thing, which is really nice. Now, in some cases, you are going to want a newer version of code. So perhaps you also want to just say something that's greater than that version. Or if you want it between versions, you can say greater than or equal to, and then comma, less than 0.66.0, right? So then it's only going to install those versions of FastAPI. So anything greater than today, but less than maybe something in the future. Now, in my experience, FastAPI doesn't make dramatic changes that would break things in future versions, but it is a good idea to at least isolate it at this time. In the future, we could always change that. But the nice thing is, from here on out, whenever I run pip install -r requirements.txt, it's going to install whatever that latest version is, which I think is pretty cool. We might actually have to run pip install in the future on our production environment as well. But anyway, so that's definitely one package that we will want in between these two versions. The next thing is I want to use another package called Jinja2. This is actually how we're going to render out HTML templates. I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of how that works. Realistically, I'm going to render out something from this HTML folder and just make it really, really basic up front. Next, we want to actually use a package called UVicorn. So this is for asynchronous web applications. Again, this is a little bit more advanced than what we're talking about here, but FastAPI itself can be an asynchronous web application, so it needs to use UVicorn to actually run in production and locally, which we will see. Next, we want to use GUnicorn. So GUnicorn is for production version of UVicorn, and they actually work together in the case of FastAPI. Again, we will see that in a moment. So anyway, so those are the requirements for these packages. So let's go ahead and save it. And I'm going to go ahead and do a git status, and we're going to go ahead and do git add period, and then git commit, and we'll say updated project requirements. And we'll go ahead and do git push Linode main, hit enter, and then jump into our Linode project here. And I'm inside of this virtual environment. And again, I can use bin pip and then or install, then -r requirements.txt. Notice that requirements file did come in as we sort of expected. I can hit enter, and this will now add all of those requirements from our virtual environment. And if we actually cd into that bin and list things out, we should see GUnicorn and UVicorn inside of that bin, much like we have locally. somewhere in here, or in ours, it doesn't look like maybe it is showing up. So I'll have to maybe refresh my virtual environment locally, but in production it's there, which is great. Okay, so locally, let's just double check that those things were installed, and it's possible that I actually never ran that installation, so maybe that's why. So let's go ahead and do pip install -r requirements.txt, and that must have been why. So now it's actually installing there, and there it is on both places. So UVacorn and GUnicorn. Great. So now we have all of the baseline requirements that we need, and we have a way to be specific about the requirements or just put them between versions. This is like my new favorite way to declare requirements. But again, if there's something that's mission critical, you're probably going to want to be very specific about what the requirements, so you do local testing before you get into production. So now let's just go ahead and create our FastAPI app. So I had some import in here already, which is from FastAPI. It imports the FastAPI class, and we want to initialize this app. And it's really simple. You just say app is equal to FastAPI, just like that. Now, of course, if you don't have experience with Python, this might not feel that simple. So definitely check out my 30 Days of Python series. It's a basic introductory series on YouTube. And even the first 15 days or so will get you pretty familiar with what's going on here. And so once we have a FastAPI app declared, we can do @app.get and then a / here. And then we'll do define read index or root. And then I'm just going to return a dictionary, and we'll call it hello:world. Okay, so incredibly simple, not a whole lot going on here. It's just a Python function with a decorator that is really handling our index page. So if you're familiar with HTML, it's an HTML index page, or like localhost and then /, right? Or some sort of port, let's say 8000 and /. That's it. So if I wanted a different page or handle a different route, I could then say something like ABC, and this would be ABC, and then this would be called read ABC. You just need to make sure the function names are different, and this would be hello ABC, or something along those lines, right? So we can actually spend a lot of time working out a lot of things related to FastAPI, but this is actually very similar to a program called Flask, or an app called Flask, another Python web application framework, which is incredibly popular. But now we've got main.py. So the question is, how do I actually run this item? And I know it off the top of my head, but you probably don't. Maybe you do. But let's go ahead and jump into the documentation for FastAPI. Now, me personally, I use this all of the time. I use documentation for all of these different open source projects all the time, because they often solve problems in advance that you might not have solved yet, but also they just show you really simple things like examples on how it works. So in this case, we've got examples over here, and we've got one for run it. And what do you know? There is my command to run it. And notice that it says main:app. And mine says main and app. Yes, I did that on purpose to make it really easy for you. So UVacorn main:app and then -- reload. I'll explain that in a moment. But the idea is that UVacorn package that we just talked about, and then the main.py file, which is this right here, and then the actual app module itself, which is app. We'll look at this in a different way in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and run that and hit enter. Notice that there's a URL here. If you're on VS Code, you can do right click or control click and open this up. And what do you know? It says hello world. So I actually have an app running, and if I go to ABC, hello ABC. So congratulations, you just created your first Python web application if you've never done this before. It's really exciting, and hopefully you feel that it's not very hard, right? It's actually pretty easy to do this. And so let's actually put this on our server and see if we can do something similar. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control C and do git status. So Control C actually closes this thing out. Now I have a couple files that are new. So I've got PyCache. I do not want that. We don't need to send that in here. So let's add it into our gitignore file down here. Okay, so let's save that. And then I'll do git status again. And all I want here is that gitignore file. That's fine, as well as main. And I'll do git add -- all git commit and updated our web app. And then we'll do git push Linode and main. And there we go. So it did push it, or at least it should have. If we go into SSH and our SSH session as this user, and then back into the root of that app, we see it here. And so again, I can try Ben and then uviacorn. So uviacorn, and then it was main : app and then -- reload. I can hit enter and it runs. I don't actually have an error showing up. This is like one of the coolest things about how all this works. This is actually on my Linode server. Now, the unfortunate thing is this URL right here. That is not a valid URL in the sense that if I try to open it and I don't have it running locally, in my case, I canceled it out if you recall. It's not running locally. So it's actually not able to access that, right? And so you might be tempted to go, oh, well, what about this? And then just do :8000 and hit enter and see if that actually works. Well, this should not work. And the reason for that is because we added in that firewall. If we didn't have that firewall, there's a good chance that this could have worked, right? Because it would have potentially exposed that port of 8000. We did not allow that port to be exposed, and therefore it's impossible for us to access this. So we could totally test it out and get that port working and try to see if it's actually running correctly. But that's not actually what I want to do. Instead, what I want to do is I want to set up Nginx and another program called Supervisor to actually run this for us. I don't ever want to have to run uviacorn at all. I don't actually want to have to run anything on my server. I want it to be set up and configured, and then it does all the things it needs to do to get to the point where it's actually running. I mean, that is probably painfully obvious, but the idea here is we don't want to do any of the work. We want our server to do all of the work. So yeah, we still have a few more configuration items to go, but that is our first web application. I think that's really cool. Hopefully you do as well. And similar to getting my first web page in production on a server, it was like mind-blowingly fun. This is probably, hopefully, similar to you, but of course it's going to be even better once you actually put this on production. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you got a lot out of this one. And if you did, be sure to do a thumbs up and share this with a friend of yours that might get something out of it. Now, of course, if you do have questions or you want to let us know about something else, please write it down in the comments below so myself or the Linode support team can actually help you diagnose some of these issues. Once again, I'm Justin, and I look forward to seeing you next time.